Check 1 2 check. They got a cookie and we didn't. We must have gotten the diet.
Yeah, we got the healthy boxes. We should have gone for the junk food session.
Darren come along, but
So very excited to share the panel with you. Really enjoyed your work, reading your output.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't know
Always
much.
very incisive
Really,
and thoughtful.
they sent it off.
So 1,100 people.
Goodness.
This is my con.
Always good to double check.
Yeah.
Test 1, 2.
Yeah.
Just make sure my phone is silent. I believe so. It is.
Scored some tickets to the Clinton stage tomorrow. My daughter wants to see it. She's like, I'm not interested, but I was like, okay. I think she's going to go with me. You do this. You go see the Snickers.
Could use some the tickets. Start promptly on Apple time.
Yep. Oh, yeah, you got to do that. Absolutely. Find out what this conference is. I paid no attention to it.
Well, there's so much going on. There's like lots of activity, and the semester has just ended, so most of us are just recovering.
On Saturday, so.
Yeah, there's a lot of activity. I mean, it's good that there are things happening, but it can easily be overwhelming.
Yeah. I'm just surprised at the size. I guess this is Charlottesville turning out. Is it? I wonder where they're all from. Well, Virginia, the region. This is the Miller Center is a big deal, actually. They do all the interviews.
Good afternoon
You know this?
I didn't know
Welcome.
they did the presidential.
to our lunch section on
They,
religion and democracy. My name is Nicole Flores. I'm Assistant Professor of Religious Studies here at the University of Virginia. And it's my pleasure to moderate the panel this afternoon. In his letter to the Danbury Baptists, Thomas Jefferson declared that there is a, quote, wall of separation between church and state. This separation is reflected in our legal and political practices and traditions in the United States, even as interpretive debates persist about its meaning, scope, and practical implications. It is a category mistake, however, to claim that there is a separation between religion and democracy. Religious beliefs and ideas, people and institutions help to shape how we respond to the most crucial questions and challenges that face our democracy today. Therefore, our question is not whether religion is engaged in the life of democracy, but how. Our esteemed panelists are well positioned to help us consider the relationship between religion and democracy in the past, present, and as we move into the future. But before I introduce them, I'd like to give us a sense of the questions that will guide our conversation for today. First, what role has religion played in American public life? Second, what role might it play going forward? Third, what role ought it play? And fourth, how has that role been altered by demographic changes in the United States and around the world in recent decades? These questions invite our panelists to weigh in on historical, descriptive, theoretical, and ethical dimensions of this question today. So I'll introduce our panelists now, I'm just going straight down the line. First, we have Jelaine Schmidt, who is Associate Professor of Religious Studies here at UVA. We have Jamel Bowie, columnist for the New York Times, also a graduate of University of Virginia, Arts and Sciences in 2009. we have Sylvester Johnson, Professor of Religion and Culture and Director of the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech. And last but not least, we have Kathleen Flake, the Richard Lyman Bushman Professor of Mormon Studies, also here at UVA. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. So our first question for today, and we'll just go ahead and go straight down the row here in responding to this. What role has religion played in American public life?
Well, religious organizations, and I like to speak in terms of kind of institutions and institution building rather than a kind of abstraction called religion, so religious practices and institutions. So religious institutions have played an important role in building American civic life. Just if you think in terms of important organizations and institutions that are kind of dot the landscape. Here we think, hospitals, including, especially in, late 19th and early 20th century development of mental hospitals, kind of reform movements and this sort of thing. Kind of progressive era reforms, kind of addressing, issues. Well, we have, of course, the legacy of prohibition, but also, other, still more enduring interventions, in, child labor and, and this sort of thing. Universities, so many of which were, founded by religious denominations, many of which have, kind of gone, rather far from their previous, religious moorings, but still, important parts of the landscape. So in terms of, health and, higher education, this has been, these have been really important, of course, in terms of social reform. I've already mentioned the, progressive era, and of course, the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. And then, more toward our era, in the mid 20th century, civil rights era, and the many church and kind of para-religious organizations that were struggling in the civil rights era. So there's a lot of kind of in terms of kind of creating civic life in America. The contribution of these religious organizations has been integral to that history.
It's sort of, Jillian gets at the I guess the central interest of this is that the United States is a very religious country, always has been, and religion is just part of how civic life has been formed in this country from the very beginning. Every major reform, or not every, but most major reform movements have, hopefully I'm not angering someone. The major reform movements have ties to or roots in religious movements. Again, I don't want to recapitulate what Jillian said. To add to that, I'd say if you look at on a even more granular level, sort of just practical politics in every area of American life, churches and religious organizations have played an important role in organizing people to actually engage in political life. So, at the turn of the 19th century or the 20th, first decade of the 20th century, and there's a massive influx of immigration from Central Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. Those immigrants, when they arrive in American urban centers, they're part of what's organizing them to engage on politics on the ground are churches, are the religious organizations. And fast forward 100 years, there's still remnants of that in many major cities. Those old machines, they still kind of exist in some way, shape, or form, with churches being an important center. That's true for African American politics for a variety of reasons, mostly kind of the effects of segregation. Churches nexus for black political engagement and have been since emancipation. There's in the very modern era, after the civil rights era, white evangelicals, their kind of engagement with politics is through these political movements which are heavily tied to a wider religious culture, religious institutions. And so, to add, I guess, a little commentary, every so often, you shouldn't have churches engage in politics. You shouldn't have kind of religion shouldn't play a role in sort of direct political decision making. And it's, whether it should or shouldn't, it does. Like, that's just how it's been in the United States. And I don't think that's going to change, given the fact that Americans, even with the decline of frequent church going, Americans still remain more religious than their counterparts in Western Europe, in Australia, certainly in quite a few other countries. And religious organizations and religious institutions still remain important points of contact and mediation for millions of Americans to engage with the political process.
Among the many functions of religion in the United States is its role in shaping something that experts refer to as political community, who's in and who's out of democracy. So when we think about the demos in democracy, in a very simplified way, one might think, well, that demos from the Greek word for people means all the people get to participate, not just in governing and belonging to the political community of that state. But historically, what's actually happened is more like an ethnos, that there are some people who have been the people who get to define the political community of that state, even though there are lots of others who are there in that state, in the United States, who are treated as if they can't belong to it. And religion has actually had among its role this function of shaping that political community of who's in and who's out. So even before there was a United States, if you think about the settler colonial history of the Americas, this term of Christian, that identity functioned to mean in the Americas not indigenous, not Native American, or not of African descent. And it wasn't only what we think of as a religious meaning, it was also functioning in what we might think of as a racial meaning. If we think about this in juxtaposition to Jewishness, where Jewishness is understood in a very complicated way, it's not just a religion, it could also be an ethnicity or cultural heritage. Christianity has actually functioned for a long time in that manner, particularly in distinction to Jewishness or to Muslimness. And that's been part of its history in the United States. In the 19th century particularly, there was a lot of structured activities and practices that juxtaposed Protestantism to Catholicism. And that was another way of shaping belonging and marginalization, where Catholics were treated as outsiders. So it was a big deal when JFK was elected president of the United States. It's the first Catholic president. And that was a jolt in the sense because of this history of deciding who's in and who's out. Particularly in the 20th century, more recently, what we see is this continued function of religion in shaping political community around Muslimness versus Americanness, into something that cannot be coherent with Muslim identity or Muslim subjectivity. So Muslims are treated as outsiders despite the fact that Islam has a long history in the Americas and that American history has been replete with participation of peoples identified as Muslims. So many different roles there that this panel is articulating, but among those is shaping political community. It's been ongoing. It has, in that way, functioned, and as just a historical fact, it's been part of how democracy has operated as ethnocratically, and not for everybody. Ideally, it should be historically something else has been going on, and religion is part of that story.
So I agree with my colleagues that one of the major functions of religion has been to provide coherence for democracy, and some of that coherence has gone awry and violated many of our professed values. It is a work in progress, the United States and religion, both in general, but I agree with what Jelaine has said, that in our field in particular, we say there is no such thing as religion. There are only religions in the plural, you know. And so there's no real abstraction. Nonetheless, this thing that we tend to call religion has been very functional for the United States as a democracy. It was the way in which democracy found a way to cohere, as I said. So when Adams is writing Jefferson, I had to bring him up, right? You know where you are. So when Adams was writing Jefferson and explained to him what was going on while he was enjoying France and the Constitution was being constructed, he said, what could we agree upon? So this fine collection of beautiful young men is what he said. And he goes through the whole list. Catholics, Jews, Socinians. He names them philosophically. He says house Protestants and horse Protestants. Do you know what the difference is there? Sure you do. House Protestants, the standing churches, horse Protestants, right? The Methodists, people riding around, right? Gathering people.
Oh,
He
the
says, so we've got
circuit
all these different
preachers.
kinds. He says, so what could we agree on? Because democracy is an ideological product, right? It's an idea that then gets a territory, right? So he said, what could we agree on? He said two things: the fundamental principles of British liberty, right? You know what those are? That you have to charge a person. You can't just jail them, right? You have to, maybe it's corpus. You have to produce the body. You have to show why they're in jail. Those kinds of things we could agree on. And he said the general principles of Christianity. That's what we can agree on, the general principles of Christianity. Now you go, whoa, that's exclusive. In their mind, it was universal, right? To the 18th, 19th, early 19th century mind, that was universal. And that was one of the things that's caused a lot of national pain over the next 200-300 years. And what were those general principles? They just thought that was morality because they thought Christian morality was unique. It isn't until they go to Africa and to China and they say, wait a minute, we're not so unique. These other people too are good. What do we do with that? That's another story, having to do with another turn of a century. But they thought morality, they turned to religion for morality, and it's that morality that would make us cohere as a nation. We would share the same idea of what was good and what was bad. Well, you know that story. You're living through it yourself right now. As morality, they didn't realize that morality was subjective, right? That it's going to change, and that'll get to some of our other questions. But religion served that function in the early republic, much to the cost of certain peoples in that republic. Sylvester's mentioned several groups. I would add the Latter-day Saints, of course, that were the object of state-sponsored, not just popular violence, in a way that we'll get to in other questions. So this is a mutually reinforcing and irritating relationship between the nation-state and its religions. I'll say only one other thing, because I think it might be of interest to you, because I know we need to get on to other questions, right?
Yes.
So America created a particular kind of religion that we call the denomination, that had no formal relation to the state, that had no territorial claim, and had no claim to unique truth. In fact, it was a purposeful organization. They came up with their own purpose, and usually that purpose was to continue their religious ideas. And so the purposefulness of American religion became these various social endeavors that you've heard described earlier that were dedicated to maintaining a certain idea of the state, whether it was temperance or whether it was preserving slavery, right? There was both. This tension, it continues. So I guess the bottom line to that question is each has a functional relation to the state that can be defined variously as the culture changes over time up until 2019. So.
Wonderful, thank you. I want to keep building on this theme of how religion or religions are creating and shaping civic life. So in addition to this rich kind of sample of American religious history that we've started to think about, as Dr. Flake pointed out, we are living a story right now. We are experiencing the way that religion is engaged in shaping American public life right now. So to that point, I would like each one of you to weigh in on what role is religion playing now? And perhaps in addition to that, you might comment on what role might it play? So what is it doing now? What might it be doing in the nearest future?
Yeah. Well, first of all, just to kind of I mean, of course, religion is playing a role in public life here, and I'm going to comment, about that with respect to race, specifically racialization, which, kind of race as a verb, that is, assigning races to people, and then race as a category, kind of doing actual ideological work, in the public sphere and stuff. So, and this is nothing new. I mean, we can go back to the Virginia colony, as far back as Jamestown, and look at how, as Rebecca Getz has, how religious institutions and practices have been imbricated in creating racial categories, assigning value to human bodies based on, kind of, varieties of melanin content, and this sort of thing. So that goes, way back to, the House of Burgesses and this sort of thing, laws about baptism and inheritance and, and all this sort of thing, and then assigning, by religious affiliation, and saying that, a new innovation here was that it was somehow inheritable. Well, that's, kind of a, different sort of doctrine, that was, kind of a unique here. So anyway, this is to say it's nothing new, and then we, fast forward to, the 1920s, Singh versus United States, Hindu, as he was called, he was actually Sikh, is suing for U.S. citizenship, and he's turned down by the Supreme Court because, he's not a practicing Christian. Anyway, there are, many cases that we can look at here where religion, and specifically Christianity, is, kind of identified with whiteness and belonging, this sort of thing. Now, so anyway, fast forwarding to the present, what we're dealing with now, particularly with the rise in authoritarianism here, we're seeing, the kind of privileged position that's being doled out, to specifically, particularly to white religious organizations, and how these, talking about, kind of the elephant in the room, which is whiteness, and being able to see it, and how religious identities, are tied in with kind of marking, again, certain people for belonging and stuff, as Dr. Johnson, talked about too, the ethnos and the, and the demos, and the kind of sliding, between these categories. So, yeah, so I want to call attention to that, how, in the present day, how, again, religious institutions, and activities, not religion in some sort of abstract, are playing a role in racial identification and the mobilization of racial, of categories of race, and specifically whiteness, toward political power, this sort of thing. As to how this might, that was a very kind of dour assessment there, with respect to, what might, how these religion and civic life might change. We have been seeing a resurgence in the religious left, which actually never went away. It was just, I think, just the press went away, from this, but we're seeing kind of some more assertiveness there, on the part of, say, Reverend Barber and other figures, the nuns on the bus, and this sort of thing. And so, I think there's kind of possibilities, for engagement, for, self-identified progressives that, also, identify with, certain religious institutions, to, and, I'm thinking in terms here, we can point to a certain, Christian and Jewish organizations that are involved in anti-fascism work, seeing, calling it, not afraid to use the F word, by which I mean fascism, and kind of identifying the current climate, and calling it out for the authoritarianism that it is, and then using, or kind of, identifying, the history, for instance, of Jewish anti-fascism in Europe, and also, 1930s, U.S., and kind of, reviving, that rich well there, of anti-fascist organizing. So I'm seeing that, really pick up, that there is, there's, certainly a religious progressive tradition that's getting more attention and, getting more energy and stuff, and a sort of, very, forthright kind of anti-fascism, among certain religious progressives. Well,
I want to pick up on this idea of Christianity sort of being used to create racial differentiation, or help shape racial differentiation and shape racialization and define racial categories. And I think American politics of the last 10 years specifically has seen that in very dramatic ways, right? So what else was the birther charge against Barack Obama then essentially, the train of logic was Barack Obama has a sort of foreign-sounding name, and he is black, and regardless of what his stated religious beliefs are, and sort of by the time all this crops up, we know he attended church, we know he worked in a Catholic parish, although that's factual information, but the logic train is, his father was Muslim, and so Islam takes this almost racial character. His father is Muslim, therefore he must have some sort of Muslim sympathies. And he's also black, and so together those things mark him as foreign, mark him as illegitimate, someone upturning an established order of things whereby to be president and to have the legitimacy of the president, you don't just have to be Christian, you have to be white and Christian. And even that, as Dr. Johnson mentioned earlier, JFK was a Catholic, and so there's that tension there. But in the years since, that's expanded, so Catholics count now. There are questions about whether there are questions about whether Mitt Romney would have counted in this. I remember distinctly in 2011, will white evangelicals accept Mitt Romney as sort of like a Christian president if he's elected?
The answer was no.
The answer was no.
Yeah.
But the broad point is that in real time we kind of witnessed how Christianity and whiteness were both for certain segments of the public understood to be kind of together, a package deal, in that groups that or people that fell outside of them were held as suspicious. And an interesting thing, just a thing about the 2016 election and sort of Donald Trump's the relationship Trump developed with white evangelicals and the extent to which he has built an exceptionally strong partnership with kind of the white evangelical movement is that his argument to those groups was exactly this. It was to say the United States is changing demographically. The United States therefore must be changing religiously. And if you don't elect me, then the kind of cultural import you have or that you want will be out of reach for you. I'm sort of a bulwark against the kind of changes that would cause a irrevocable decline in white Christian America. So there, Trump, who is, again, not a religious man, is sort of, it's like the opposite of a religious person, nonetheless sort of picks up on the extent to which, for a critical segment of the public, how they understand the proper order of things in the United States is one where white Christianity, a particular brand of white Christianity at that, ought to be the organizing principle for public life, and people who are outside of that or diverge from it have to be turned away, have to be defeated, have to be delegitimized, and I think you're still seeing some of that. I think it's I think that if the migrants coming to the United States from the southern border were whiter and maybe even not Catholic, the political response to them from some of Trump's own supporters would be very different, right? That they would be understood as potentially belonging. And sort of evidence for that is that these aren't migrants, but the kinds of undocumented immigrants that are not the target of ICE or Customs and Border Patrol are European immigrants who may hold Protestant religious views. But the critical thing is the European immigrants, and thus, even if they aren't religious, aren't necessarily seen as a threat to kind of a imagined order of things in the United States.
I'll be very brief. The future of religion in the United States is theocracy. And we can tease it out later. And I think that's what's happening.
Wow.
I think I said that the future of religion in the United States is theocracy, meaning the effort to create a state that is very explicitly controlled by religious law, specifically Christian law. I think that has been a dream of many Christians for a long time. If you look at the origins of settler colonialism, think about the so-called Puritan experiment, who were often narrated as fleeing persecution from Europe. They were not coming to establish freedom, they were coming to establish a theocracy, which is what they set up. And there are different histories of settler colonialism, but that's one of the important ones, and that has long been a dream of many American Christians, and not only American Christians. But what we've seen very recently, and I would say recently, I would try to explain this as having some important foundations in the shifts that happen over the legibility of being religious, and including being Christian since the Civil Rights Movement, which was a fight over is being religious and particularly Christian about creating social justice, or is it something else that is a much more totalitarian vision of the political state and the realm? And I think what we are seeing is an outgrowth of something called dominion theology that Michelle Goldberg has written quite eloquently about, that is essentially the theocratic view that the laws of a state, here the United States, need to be based on biblical law. But that's what's happening. That's what we're seeing. And I think that's where this could go.
Yeah, what I see Sylvester's point.
Please tell me I'm wrong.
I think you are.
Because I was about,
Dr.
I'm
Blake
on my
has
way to
no
Canada, and
problem
I
telling
have a
someone
couple
they're
empty seats.
But what I agree with is that there is a really strong feeling in the United States right now that that is true, that religion has an outside sense of power, or outside has a bigger hand on the levers of power, right? At the same time, what I find fascinating, this is where I get to step back and just be my academic self, you have an equal and opposite anxiety on the part of religion that starting at least in the 1990s, it got a label with the need to restore religious liberty, right? As if with the peyote case, those of you know the peyote case, that undoing of the standard of review by the courts of religious free exercise meant the destruction of the First Amendment. So one of the great chasms in our culture today is this equal and opposite sincere belief that the other side is out of control. And no one is talking to each other about that, because there just isn't some kind of language that is moving us forward. And we could say that about other subjects that will come up today. So just one poll among millennials, the conviction that religious liberty is a good thing has diminished by 25% in the last 10 years. Because religion and religious freedom restoration acts are seen as, you know this phrase, an excuse to discriminate, right? And so while on the one side, which I think is inadequately expressed as the left or the right, you know, but on the one side, whichever side we're talking about, there is this view that religious people are only seeking to restrain the rights of others, right? And then with religious people, there's this feeling that their rights are being restrained, and that's one of the hottest crises I think we have right now in terms of the functioning of our government and the ability to understand that rights are always a balancing act. There is no positive right that is exclusively belonging to anybody. And to the extent that someone does have a right, it's almost always going to come at the expense of another. And so our system of government has always relied on, inadequately or not, a balancing of those rights. Let me say one other thing. I learned something, two other things, sorry. I'll say it quickly.
We have 15 minutes.
Two other things. One is there's no question that religion has been gasoline on the fire of institutionalizing racism. That what religion brings to the discussion of racism is that gasoline that says, God told me to, right? And so religion must take responsibility for its institutionalization. You can look no further than the extreme example. One of the great examples is the Civil War, when the churches could not find a solution to slavery, and they broke and have not come back together over this, actually. And then people said, well, if the churches can't do it, then how can we as a nation do it? And Katie barred the door, we were at war. Okay, so religion has been must take cop a plea to both failing to live up to its own ideals in this, and also adding fuel to the fire in the country. Finally, I learned this in an engagement with the Chinese. I took for granted the voluntary association dimension of religion that was our charitable backbone in this country. When China had an earthquake, the only people who showed up were the army, and the army can't do it. And so they were coming here saying, tell us how you get this voluntary activity by religion. And it's true, if you look at Katrina and you look at Puerto Rico, who was there when everything else failed? It was the religious groups. So I think we need to be more aware without eroding that dimension of Kappa Plea that I just said, that there is a really strong contribution by religious institutions and religious people to the social welfare dimension of this country, and including disaster relief. Okay, I'm done.
Well, I want to circle back a little bit to a theme that came up in each one of your comments in a different way. So we've talked a little bit about the alignments, the political alignments between certain aspects of the religious right, specifically white evangelicals, and particular political forces. But we've also mentioned the emerging or re-emerging, perhaps, involvement of the religious left. And I wonder if any of you wanted to weigh in and describe to us a little bit more what's happening with the religious left, what the role is, perhaps if this has anything to do with this. Does it allay your concern or exacerbate your concern that we are moving in a theocratic direction in our democracy right now?
I don't know how much I can say about the religious left, but with regards to the religious right, I think an important dynamic that's happening in American society, and not just with religion, but a whole host of other things, is that they're becoming they're starkly aligned with political partisanship. So 30 years ago, 40 years ago, if you were white and evangelical, or put this another way, if you were a Republican, that didn't necessarily tell you all that much demographic information about you. You may be white and evangelical, you may be, I mean, you're probably, 40 years ago, you probably are white at the very least, but you don't, your cultural views, your religious views, all these other views about race aren't necessarily aligned with that partisan identity. But over the last 15 years, that's really changed. So now, if you just pluck out a random Republican or a random Democrat, you can actually learn a whole bunch, you can guess a whole bunch about that person's not political beliefs, but like cultural beliefs, where they might live, where they might worship, whatever, just by knowing the fact that they're Republican. Let's say they voted for Republicans in the previous 4 elections. And that alignment of in particular, Republican political identity, and in particular, white evangelical religious identity, has, I think, kind of accelerated. It's like it is another accelerant in polarization. It kind of adds this additional moral dimension that you're seeing now, that you saw in 2016. That it is not just politically advantageous for my particular beliefs or interests to support this candidate, but if I don't do it, if I don't vote for Donald Trump, if I don't vote for Roy Moore, then my religious practice is threatened as well. And that's something that, you know, it's not happening in the same way on the left. That kind of, at least on religion, that kind of alignment with partisanship isn't yet happening. A good sort of example of this is that among Democrats, African American Democrats are more religious, more likely to attend church on a weekly basis, more likely to hold views on issues like abortion that you would associate with like conservative religiosity, but that is not really connected to their partisan identity. It's sort of, for your typical black Democrat, they may say, you know, I'm uncomfortable with abortion, but I'm going to vote for a pro-choice candidate because those two things aren't connected politically for me. Maybe that'll change, and if that changes, that will add like an additional element of polarization to how politics are happening.
I was going to say, with respect to the religious left, there's been a lot of leadership on the religious left with respect to pipeline opposition, you know, and you know, environmental, you know, environmentalism, in a way that, I mean, that, you know, certainly folks on the religious right are, you know, don't believe in climate change and, you know, all these sorts of things. But in terms of mobilization, I see more of that with environmentalism. I see more of that on the religious left. You know, in terms
So it's having a catalyzing effect,
yes,
potentially.
yes, yes. You know, and there are many examples. I mean, you know, certainly out at Standing Rock, you know, where you had indigenous leaders there and a lot of, you know, church activists, you know, coming in from across the country, you know, there. in our very own backyard here in Virginia, Union Hill. There's a coalition of religious leaders from African American Protestants to local Buddhist community, and kind of banding together and this sort of thing. So that is kind of heartening, I think, and I see more energy there on the religious left in terms of mobilizing, about environmentalism. With respect to also with kind of attending to the immigration crisis, and especially refugees at our southern border. Again, just in terms of actual mobilization by religious groups, I see more left religious folks taking that on, and progressive religious organizations seem to be mobilizing more around that. Now, certainly the conservatives, again, if you kind of pluck out a random Republican, in this you're going to have opposition, to that kind of to the flow of refugees and accepting asylum cases, and attending to the weak and vulnerable, and your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. There's going to be more opposition to that. But in terms of kind of actual religious organizations mobilizing, I'm seeing more. I have no empirical evidence to back this up, but just what I'm noticing, it seems that there are more kind of progressive groups that are attending to this than conservative religious groups that are kind of actively kind of dunking on these things. So,
Dr. Johnson or Dr. Flake?
I think one of the most influential, religiously grounded social movements that happened in the U.S. historically is a civil rights movement. It was a Southern Christian Leadership Conference that led that movement. And something interesting happened in that movement that is, I think, important for understanding where we are and the question of what's happening with the religious left and religious right, to use that binary. That is, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had to create a new denomination just to execute their movement. They leave the National Baptist Convention because it was a fundamentalist movement. And they created a new one, the Progressive National Baptist Convention. And this is something that is often not engaged with in trying to understand what was happening, largely. But what was happening was a fight about the public meaning, specifically of Christianity. Was it going to mean, or did it mean, trying to create a good society, thinking in terms of social justice, or was it based on, I'll say, the two P's, of persecution and purity? That Christians are a persecuted group who need to reclaim their dominance in society, to have dominion, and to create what was called moral purity, but which is very selective. And the people who won that fight, despite a retrospective look at the civil rights movement and seeing it as having some important victories, but nationally what was happening, the people who won that were the latter. And so that is why today you will read or hear people speaking about being religious or Christian, meaning being anti-gay, or that they need the right to respond to these cultural revolutions, so-called culture wars that have eroded the place of Christianity, despite the fact that you also have Christians who have outright commitments, very articulate commitments to being inclusive, to supporting LGBTQ rights, and who don't define being Christian as trying to convert other people to Christianity, who see it as social justice, who see it as creating a better society. But the point is that the legibility of those leftists is not being religious and being people of faith. The legibility publicly, I mean, at an intellectual level, we can understand all of those people are Christians. But that doesn't work as a public discourse or as a social movement. What motivates the legibility, the recognition of what it means to be a true believer is actually that very fundamentalist movement. And that has increased significantly. And it is certainly true. First of all, you ask what's going to happen in the future. Obviously, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. No one actually knows the future. But I want to be a little provocative in saying this is where I see things going. But I'm not convinced that this is going to all end nicely. I think anything could happen. And I think that it makes a difference, for example, when you try to understand on which side of this debate are very powerful institutions such as a surveillance state or national security practices. Is it on the leftist side where we want to be inclusive for everybody, urged on the side of someone who actually became president of this country, running on the claim that he was going to ban Muslims from this country, because being a Muslim is actually a threat to the United States, because that's what guides policing, that's what guides surveillance, that's what guides our national security paradigms, that's what guides the military infrastructure. And there is a, I'm going to use this language, holy war that drives the military infrastructure of this country right now. And it's a war against Islam. It's a war against Muslims. And it's happening within the United States, and it's happening abroad. And billions of dollars in anti-terrorism or counterterrorism funding are part of this economy. And so it's certainly true that there are differences of perception, that there are people who think that they're trying to promote, I'm going to use the example of reproductive rights or right to abortion, on the one hand, who see themselves as being persecuted or losing power, and those who see themselves as wanting to protect the sanctity of life. It's important to understand that those people are not typically interested in being against the death penalty. And that's why it's important to have an objective understanding of people say things, okay? So you have a hodgepodge of opinions. Now, what's actually going on? And so we have to have a way of understanding what's really going on, because if everyone feels like they're losing power or the other side is winning, you can't conclude that everybody's wrong or right. There has to be some objective understanding. And part of the way to get to that objective understanding is to actually assess institutions of power, is to look at those practices, is to develop some metrics about what's going on. So I don't know the future, but my language for this is something like the American Taliban. I think that what we're seeing is an unprecedented, a cultural victory that happened in the 20th century that has not been fully engaged with by experts, because somebody won that fight over the public meaning of Christianity. It doesn't mean that at a rigorously intellectual level, we can't see that all of those different kinds of actors are Christians. And I don't want to be misunderstood. I hope that you don't think I'm saying that people who are religious are trying to create a theocracy, all of them. There are many different expressions of religion. That's not my claim. What I'm saying is that there are real differences in power, and I'll end with this. One of the things that we are contending with as we move forward in the next 2 or 3 decades is that there has been for about 15 years now increasing sensitivity and understanding in a very alarmist tone, I will say, about the changing demographics of the United States, meaning that white people will not continue to be a majority. And what has also happened within that context is the understanding of those 2 P's, persecution and purity, where Christians who differ from their Christian colleagues, their Christian compatriots who have a more inclusive understanding of Christianity, who say that Christianity is no longer, they look at the past when Catholics, when the U.S. did go to war against Mormons, and Catholics were marginalized, and Jews and Muslims had no legitimate place in society, as the good old days, as something that they've lost, and they want it back, and they're trying to get it back. And the urgency that attends those struggles along racial and religious lines is being driven by the changing demographics of race that partly explain a lot of the political developments that we're seeing. Now, if you look at that within the context of these very powerful institutions, and on whose side they're on, and you take both a global and a domestic/national assessment of what's happening, I'm actually very concerned about the direction, and I'm not convinced that things are just going to be okay. I think that we're on a path to theocracy.
We're at time, but Dr. Flake, go ahead and give your response.
I'll yield if you want.
Oh, okay. Well, it's up to you. Well, we can continue these conversations. I just want to respect that we have time for question and answer here. So I'll open up the floor. If you can just, when I call on you, introduce yourself briefly. Oh, yes, and can you make your way towards the mic back there so we can hear you across the room? So if you have a question, please
Actually,
come over to the mic.
Way. Sorry, because you can't get through this way because we have too many people. So if you come around this way.
Contrary to the idea of
Can you introduce yourself,
I'm
please?
David
Thank you.
Poist. I'm a longtime resident of Charlottesville, a retired Episcopal minister. In regards to we may be becoming a theocracy, how do you all respond to the latest Pew Trust poll? I think it was theirs that said 23% of America is evangelical, which is actually a decline. 23% is Roman Catholic. 23% are Jewish, mainline Protestant, and 23% are nuns, not Catholic nuns, but no religion at all. This seems contrary to any notion of a theocracy.
If you evacuate an analysis of power from that, that's true, because you can make the same claim about race with an increasingly diverse United States racial demographic. And you would then conclude that white people are losing power in the United States and that non-white people are gaining power. But if you look at the division of wealth in this country, the racial gap in wealth is greater than it's ever been before, and it's going to get a lot bigger. And if you look at the political will, and again, nobody knows the future, and I'm not trying to say this is an ineluctable destiny. Anything can be changed, and this is all historically contingent. But I don't think you can just take numbers. I think you have to assess power. And if you tell me that the increase in the numbers of Jews and Muslims and Hindus in this country has meant that Christians have lost power in this country, because that's that persecution claim that drives a lot of what we're seeing, I would say that we're counterfactual. Like, the numbers don't equal power. Mississippi was under white minority rule from 1840s until the 1940s. White people were never a majority in Mississippi until the 1940s. But you look at the anti-black and anti-indigenous violence in that state, and you see what happens when you are a minority who hold most of the power, and that's what I'm talking about. It's especially brutal.
Anyone else care to weigh in on that? Right? Yes.
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Charlene Chamberlain. I'm a high school math teacher, so I'm interested in numbers and how they intertwine as well. I have a question for you in regards to how we can look at the past to move forward in the future. I know that Thomas Jefferson did mourn the lack of impact that his Religious Freedoms Act had, and he considered his inability to promote that in our new country one of his greatest failures. He was looking not to establish a theocracy or a secular nation or a nation of Islam or an atheistic or communist nation with that act. Rather, he was trying to promote freedom of religion for all peoples from all across the world. I was wondering how we could, as a nation, revisit Thomas Jefferson's beliefs, where they came from, and how we could implement them in social policy moving forward, so that instead of becoming a theocracy of one religion or another, or a communist nation of no religion, or a secular nation, we instead become a nation founded upon and moving forward in religious freedoms for all people.
Thank you. Anna? You look like you want to weigh in.
No, Kathleen, I think
Oh,
would be great
Kathleen.
for this one. Yeah.
I think the only thing I can offer you on that, either in understanding Jefferson or understanding today, is the point I made earlier about rights don't get exercised in a vacuum. They get exercised over against somebody else. And so it's impossible to have an environment in which everybody is equally free, because not everybody doesn't want the same thing. And so what we have to have is an agreement on the things that matter most, so that we have a guide to make a decision on balancing rights. Okay? And that's why I would turn to process to answer that question. I would point out, as Sylvester has pointed out, that there's a thumb on the scale in a number of ways. I would include sexual violence to this as well. So there's a thumb on this scale, and democracy, or at least this democracy, and I think we can speak generally, is always an effort of good people trying to do their best to accommodate each other. And I don't want to be Pollyanna about that. I tend to be as demoralized as Sylvester is about it. But what else you got? You know, this is the we do think in terms of left and right, right? It's kind of an archetypal, handcuff we're in. To me, one of the interesting questions is whether Trump's amorality and his sadism is going to drive people more to the center. They're no longer going to feel they have the luxury to sit on their own, values and say, I don't have to budge. But they realize they've got to move towards each other and begin to recognize this winner take all. You can't have a winner take all system in a democracy.
Well, and it's
You have to
interesting.
compromise.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because one of the problems that Catholic Democrats are facing right now, and you mentioned this as well, Mr. Bowie, that questions on where there's more close alignments on social questions such as abortion, for example, or birth control, whether or not those questions will be ones that can be accommodated in some way within not necessarily only the Democratic Party, but within progressive discourses and allow for alliance forming, or if there will be continued sorting that makes it difficult to for people to kind of coalition build in ways that could potentially respond to significant problems. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No worries. I mean, just to add to what Kathleen said, I don't even necessarily think it's about the center, but sort of finding, not even restoring, but building a sense that each American citizen shares political equality, right? I think part of some of these conflicts come down to the very contested idea that all of us actually are politically equal and that our voices matter in equal measure, or ought to matter in equal measure in decision making. And so if you accept, right, if you really internalize this idea that everyone is politically equal, that tempers how you go about doing politics. You recognize that you can't win a final victory because winning a final victory necessarily means obliterating someone else's ability to act freely and equally in political life. And I think maybe in terms of trying to reach for some Jeffersonian ideal of religious freedom, I think even what Jefferson was reaching for is sort of this idea, trying to find some basis for shared political equality. And what I think is happening in society right now is that this is contested, that there are Americans who do not view other Americans as having the same political rights as they do. And that part of the struggle we're engaged in is not winning one victory or another, or not winning one policy victory or partisan victory, but simply kind of trying to reaffirm and strengthen these very basic democratic values that all of us have a legitimate say and an equal say in how the society moves forward, and that ought to be respected.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, my name is
Speak into the
Catherine
mic,
Brown,
please.
and thank you very much. I feel
Can you
that
speak a little bit more
Into
closely
the
to the
mic.
mic?
Yeah.
There you go. There you go.
I'm sorry.
They did tell you to put it down.
I feel that religion on a whole is something I agree with. I think that the messages that all religions send is to improve ourselves. But I believe that on the whole, religion is warped by the humans who practice the religion and so on. So I feel that what happened to this separation of church and state, wouldn't that solve the problem? Why are we putting certain judges on the bench to judge which way the whole country goes? These questions should be something voted on. We all have a vote and we should vote on it. The judges should not. What do you think about that? That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if I can say again, religion as an abstraction does not exist. People practice a religion. So this notion that there's some sort of historical corruption of religion, in some abstract by these historical actors that have, devolved it into, intolerance and this sort of thing. I can only speak in terms of historical instantiations of religion, not of theological abstractions. Although, of course, in the history of these religions, people have, kind of created these, kind of ideals about, theologies. With all due respect to my colleague here, Nicole, who's, a theologian and ethicist, in kind of doing that normative work. But in terms of history, it's like, this is what we have. We can only look at the empirical record, and how people have acted. So, yeah, I'd say that. Yeah.
In terms of judges specifically, I think I'd ask you to reconsider that you want to turn judging over to majoritarian values. I present you the state of Texas, for example. They do elect their judges. And so I think this elitism within our government serves a particular purpose. But when people violate, the law is only as good as the people who do or do not live it. And we've got a lawless administration at present, and they're packing the courts. So then you have to rely upon this separation of powers to hold them accountable for that. We're still apparently heading our way into that tunnel, and hopefully we'll find our way out of it. But I agree, it's a problem that judges that used to be independent, and the ABA used to be the premier place to go to check the backgrounds of these judges, they are being ignored. So.
Yeah, well, this is the aforementioned theocracy, that Dr. Johnson.
I don't, well.
You wouldn't call that theocracy.
I wouldn't call that the theocracy. I think that's an exploitation of religion by certain political parties that's been going on for 40 years. So, anyway, I'll stop.
Well, next question.
All right.
Sir.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your insights. I'm Don Knowles. I'm a retired Army colonel. Excuse me, and I'd like to kind of piggyback on the retired priest question. I saw an article in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago by David Leonard that said the fastest subgroup growing among religions are atheists. And he said the number's now about 22 or 23%. I may be off there a little bit. So if you take a look at the current literature like Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, and Harris, The End of Faith, and Hitchens' God is Not Great, there seems to be a trend. And so I'd like to get your sense of why atheism is growing so fast. And about the same time, Max Boot, who's a noted neoconservative thinker, wrote a piece that said it's time for an atheist president, an avowed atheist president. Now, Boot said by his own admission he's a cultural Jew, but he's an atheist. So I think it's kind of interesting. Some of the neoconservative movement is now looking for atheism too. So I like what would be the conditions do you think that would set the role for a president who is by his or her own admission an atheist? Thank you.
I don't know if there's more atheists now. I just think more of them are out of the closet.
Oh, that's probably
As it were. And there's a lot of atheists. We got one here. And there's even atheists in the pew.
Right.
And have been, for a long time. And people, attend religious ceremonies for lots of different. We got one here too. Two. Okay. So there is, I think, more visibility and maybe a climate, that makes it more acceptable for people to kind of announce their religious proclivities or lack of, religious commitments. So see that, yeah.
Yeah, I tend to think that atheism will matter politically when atheism takes on the kind of like partisan salience that other religious identities have, and until that moment. Not going to activated political identity aren't really working on your life with regards to religious belief. So I don't think, I don't think politically atheism is really going to have much force outside of the coalition that has. The political coalition that has sort of the greater number of atheists in it might feel more comfortable. Candidates might arise to feel more comfortable about talking. But it'd have to it have to become like a politically salient thing. And I think that's an important thing to understand just about politics in general, is that people have all kinds of beliefs, but they don't necessarily weigh on their political actions. You can, a great example of this that doesn't directly relate to this panel is that in 2008, a good chunk of Obama voters, probably like 15%, believed things like blacks are less intelligent than whites, blacks are lazier than whites, blacks are more violent than whites. But like their racist beliefs and their partisan political beliefs weren't attached at all. They kind of was like, yeah, I don't like black people, but like, what does that have to do with my taxes, right? So for those people, they could easily hold racist beliefs, then vote for a black president. There was no thing. There's no contradiction there. But when their racist beliefs became highly salient in political life, and that happened after the Trayvon Martin shooting, after Black Lives Matter, after the Trump campaign, then they said to themselves, okay, I really care about the fact that I don't like black people. And so if I'm going to act politically, which party or candidate best align with this thing I now really care about? And so likewise with atheism, what would have to happen for it really to matter politically is for all those Americans who are atheists, for them to say, this is something I now really care about politically. It really matters for how I vote. So which party, which thing aligns best with that? And that hasn't happened, and I kind of doubt it's going to happen. I don't know the future, but it just seems like it seems sort of like antithetical to being an atheist, that you would all of a sudden it would become this like hyper salient political thing.
I think the other thing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's a very good point, and this is related. When they do the test on who would you not vote for, the atheist always comes in at the bottom. I think it's related to John Locke, when John Locke said the only people who would not be free in his ideal society would be the atheists, because you couldn't trust them morally, because there's no one else they're accountable to, whereas everybody else has some sense of something higher than themselves that they're accountable to. Now, and I think that may be why our current president is an atheist. But you couldn't run on that platform, because people would want to know what motivates your decision. When you have to make a hard decision, to what do you have to be accountable in order to think you're doing the right thing? And I think atheists would also have to come up with their, if you will, moral platform that would inform their political identity. I think that'd go hand in hand.
That's really key. If there is ever an atheist president, that atheist president will have articulated a very strong moral framework for how they act politically.
And it could be equality, it could be, but they'd have to articulate
it. The removal of religious practice from a politician or from political life isn't the removal of like ethical or moral life from political life.
Right.
Next question, please.
Thank you all for being here. This has been wonderful. I am a born-again Methodist Episcopalian. I grew up in Selma, Alabama. I was raised without negative comment against blacks, Jews, or Catholics. I believe in climate change. I believe the primary role of government is defense and a defensible border. I did not vote for that man. I am pro-life, and I am against the death penalty. There is no irony in that statement, is there? Now my question. How can universities and each of you advise us of better ways to build consensus and community without blaming and being critical of each other? Because I experience bias and bigotry more in the last 10 years than I ever have in my life, and I now understand. I do. So.
So building consensus has to be rooted in very concrete issues and movements. It can't be abstract. And you do it around very specific projects. So if if opposition to the death penalty is important to you, there are lots of organizations and movements, individuals that are already organized against it and who want collaborators. And so you affiliate with those movements. And those movements are intersectional. If it is around something else, if it's the future of inequality, looking at the distribution of wealth, there are many organizations that are focusing on, and they're within universities, but also these are often civic groups, policy think tanks, These are volunteer organizations. Some of them are religiously based, many are not, that are focusing on those projects. But Alliance is always, if it's meaningful and significant, it's always concrete around very specific projects. And so I think it's important, you're asked, what's the role of the university, right? So one of the things that universities can do, because they're especially focused on teaching, on research, and they have missions that involve things that are emblematized by what we're doing today, that is, you involve people who are not at universities, who come from many different areas of life, to actually be in the same room, to have conversations face to face. Is that those are opportunities to address very specific concrete issues. Now, realistically, there are human actors involved in all of these movements. So if you look at something like carceral practices, one of the things that Mr. Bowie was just raising the example of Black Lives Matter and the response to it is telling. One could look at a number of different issues to see the point here. But there are institutional as well as individual actors that have shaped current carceral policing, incarceration practices globally. And so it's not just the United States, the things, although we are the most carceral nation, that is a distinction of the United States, but it's part of a larger global pattern. It's not as if no one wants to see the severe carceral outcomes that are rooted in race and class that we're seeing. Eventually, in any kind of movement that's concrete, someone's going to come under critique, because it's not if no one is responsible for anything. When we say institutional, we don't mean there aren't people doing things. We mean there are people doing things collectively through organized architectures. But the alliances, and I think what you're calling for, is a need to really take seriously the humanity of different actors, the complexity of different subject positions. You know, you're saying that you are a born again who doesn't fit a stereotype of what that often means, right? And that is what one finds again and again. And the way I think the effective role that universities can have, particularly, is one to engage more with movements. Now, that can be problematic because you're going to get phone calls from donors when you start doing that, who will tell you, I will never send another penny if you do X or Y, right? And so that is one of the complexities, and you have administrators whose job is to figure out the long-term financial viability of their institutions, who then become actors in that process. But the point is that those movements are concrete places where that can happen. The other is like this, you're just fostering dialogue. It's something that universities can do well, get people together to talk about things. And in a relationship to democracy, that is ultra important. This Miller Center has spent a lot of money to bring all kinds of folks here to do precisely that. And universities are spaces where not only discourse, but certainly discourse and talking about ideas has tremendous value and gets important, it's made important, it's treated as having its own importance and value. So that's a role, but there should be more engagement, and it has to be around concrete projects.
Other responses?
How are we doing on time?
We're doing great on time now.
Okay. This is a very good question, and it's a hard question. Universities are founded on the implicit belief that if you know better, you do better. One of the saddest lessons of my life is that that's not true. Nevertheless, I hold out hope that, for example, some of the things that we've said today might change some of your ideas. For example, those of you who think we ought to elect judges, I've suggested that there are problems with that. So maybe you'll go think about that more, and the next time you're in a conversation about that, a little bit of know better gets contributed to that. So these panels, this whole activity this weekend is designed to put in your hands such power as knowledge can give you within the moral framework that you're operating. The question becomes, the question gets harder for me. What kind of experience how can we make that knowledge more available in an era that is becoming, to me, increasingly anti-intellectuals, right? Where people are just so disappointed in the professions, all the professions, over the last 50 years, that they don't believe anybody, and now we have this problem with communication where we don't know what to believe. And where we're norming, at best, a kind of misrepresentation and varying degrees of lying that we feel powerless against. So how do we handle the flow of information? How do we get the right flow of information? And everybody seems to be living and understanding with their gut. And I don't know what universities can do in a time that is so anti-intellectual and anti-professional, except, what?
Critical thinking.
That's the problem. That's the problem. That's not the answer. That's the problem. Critical thinking is the problem. And so,
People that aren't the educated, I think this came up in the last.
do you want to go to a mic? You want to jump the
Well,
line there?
I want to respect the order here. We have someone waiting for a question. Sorry, we can continue our conversation afterwards. if
So I
necessary.
think this sense of disrespect is universal. We're firing in a circle here, folks. And so, yes, everybody feels that they've got a dog in every fight, and that they're the master of dog fighting. So I don't know what I don't know what a university can do, because we can always resort to our ivory tower. I will cop a plea on that. And but that's a major problem. I think where I tend to go, and therefore I assume everybody does, our students. We try to work with our students. We try to give them experiences with diversity that I think was implicit in the statement today. As you've lived and gotten greater experience, it's a humbling experience, and that's what we need. We need that, and we're trying to give that to our students at the same time as we're trying to teach them critical thinking. But again, this is deeper than what we think we know. So I see this university working very hard to varying degrees of success, either in their intentions or in their execution. So I'm not going to say this university's done what it needs to do in any kind of perfect world. But I think universities are, I believe my university is trying to engage that, and I'm trying to support it in the classroom and outside. That's all I can say.
We have time for one brief question, one brief answer. We're at 1 minute time.
My question is, the First Amendment provides both for free exercise of religion and no state establishment of religion. Our founding fathers were obviously brilliant in many ways, but it seems to me they created